Alright, I'd like to open this video saying my mother was my original troll and that I lived with a terrorist for over 12 years. And if anybody out there thinks they're going to throw me off the trail, you're going to have to do a hell of a lot better job than you've been doing. Because to quote a phrase from a movie I like quite a bit, I can do this all day. Alright, I'm sitting here watching the most recent episode of the X-22 Report. A show, by the way, that I highly recommend because it manages to follow fairly accurately everything that's been going on behind the scenes since Trump got elected and or Q became a actual movement. Every time I think about backing away from this ass backwards fight, something happens to draw me back in. And as an example, whenever YouTube screws with my subscriber count or puts my videos into limited state or makes my comments disappear, it doesn't weaken my resolve. As a matter of fact, it only strengthens it, because that kind of shit really pisses me off. And if someone doesn't have the balls to lock fenders with me personally, to put their bumper on my door and give a little push, I'm not going to show them any respect at all. Because doing it from behind the scenes, quite frankly, is cowardice. So instead of telling you what happened right away, I'm going to rewatch the X-22 report and cut in and out of this video with commentary on what the show was all about. And when the time comes that the event actually happened, that's when I'll fill y'all in as to what went down. And the title of the show is What We've Been Waiting For Is Coming. We have the ultimate weapon. And that's very true. And the weapon in this war is information. And those that choose not to look into the information or research the subject are quite literally helping the other side. Covered in the show is about the attempt, ever since the election, of the media companies and social media to try and keep a lid on all of this. And that's what the shadow banning policies and banning people from this platform and that platform has been all about. And it didn't work, at least wise for the most part. It might seem to a lot of people like no one's taken an interest, so I could use my channel as a perfect example. They try to make it seem like nobody cares, like nobody has anything to do with any of this. When the reality of it is, since Q became a thing and dropped his breadcrumbs into the soup, there's a lot more people onto this than most people might think. And just to make a notation for the people who are trying to suppress all this information, you cannot stamp out the truth. It's like trying to stamp on a turd. Somewhere, somehow, some of it squeaks out. And the more you press on it, the more becomes available, the more curious people become. And that's been a tactic used by the Patriots, in order to trap the people who would suppress the truth. And I realize that there are a lot of people who are turned off of the whole Q thing. I see it for what it is. A way to get the information behind the scenes into the real world of the American public. And seeing as how the other side would like to suppress all of that, they have attacked that movement from many different directions to try and discredit everything he has to say. And to some degree it has worked. I know people who were all down with the Q movement when it started, but you bring it up now, you might as well be throwing rocks at them or a bucket of poop, because it turns them completely cold. And they use the same tactics on Alex Jones, and you get the same result from people. Why they drove a wedge between Q and Alex Jones should be fairly obvious to anybody with their head screwed on straight. But I digress. Okay, to get back on topic. Does anybody remember when Donald Trump tweeted the term Kofifi? Did any of you look into that and the meanings behind it? Well, some did. And those people who did soon enough got to see Google quite literally try and change the narrative. Because they changed it, they erased the meaning to try and redirect people in the direction they wanted them to go. This is the tweet that Donald Trump put out surrounding the word Kofifi. Despite the constant negative press, Kofifi. Who can figure out the meaning of Kofifi? Enjoy. Google and the deep state, in their ultimate wisdom, set out right after Trump made that tweet to erase the word from their database. And for those of you who don't know, Kofifi is an Arabic word for stand up. And they replaced it with a shrug emoji.
Shocking.
Quote the girl that broke this story or brought it to light. So just to be crystal clear, Google has no problem whatsoever taking upon themselves to alter centuries-old language, deleting an entire word and its meaning from virtual existence in order to carry out a completely unstated, hidden political agenda. A quote from Tiffany Fitzhenry's tweets: by removing the word Kofifi, Covfefe, Google willfully defrauded the American public. They weaponized language, information meant to be available to all humans, mass manipulated through political opinions and reality itself, all in real time. And that's just a small example of what they have been doing ever since 2016. And it's a minor example of what they were looking to do nationwide if the person they wanted elected would have actually made it into office. Tweet goes on to say, the team names itself Derrida Team, foolishly gives away their intentions. Derrida, for those who don't know, was a postmodern philosopher who wrote at lengths about how to carry out the destruction of Western civilization. These are the heroes of Google foot soldiers. And for anybody that knows anything about this, you should know naturally that that statement's entirely accurate. They want to bring down what we believe in. They want to tear the fabric of our society. Let me tell you something.
because they're the most un-American, spoiled brats you ever wanted to run across.
Trump. Knowing how these people act, having spent so much time around them, everything he says and does is calculated, is mulled over beforehand before he actually does it. And the reactions are predicted before they put whatever tweet or whatever phrase or whatever statement out into the general public. All based on what the deep state will do or how the social media companies who are trying to subvert the Constitution will respond. And Dave here on the X22 report goes on to say that he thinks that was the whole Kofifi thing was all a setup to see how the social media companies and the deep state would react. And if it was, they documented all of it. And that'll be part of the antitrust suit when and if it's finally filed. On to the G7 meeting. Trump intentionally skipped the climate change meeting, saying that he wasn't going to squander the wealth produced by our energy production on windmills. Then a United Nations official, Christiana Figueres, I believe was her name, came out and basically admitted that what they're trying to do has nothing to do with climate change itself. It has more to do with the undermining of the capitalistic system. And the climate change philosophy that the globalists go by is a huge part of how they plan on taking control of our economy, of our well-being, so that they can fund themselves as we pay for it. As an example, if climate change would, why would Obama put himself in the position as the champion of climate change and then proceed to buy $1 million home positioned on beachfront property? It doesn't make any sense, unless it's all bullshit. 1970, they said we'll be in an ice age by the year 2000. 1976, these people claim that global cooling will cause a war by the year 2000. 1989, global warming and rising sea levels will wipe entire nations off the map by the year 2000. Yeah, right. 1990, we have 5 to 10 years to save the rainforests. 1999, the Himalayan glaciers will be gone within 10 years. 2000, snow will soon be a thing of the past. 2007, global warming will cause fewer hurricanes. 2008, the Arctic will be ice-free by 2013. Anybody noticing a trend here? 12, global warming will cause more hurricanes. 2014, the science is settled. Well, if that was the case, I don't think they'd have been jumping around back and forth and and predicting things that didn't actually come true if the science was settled. Let's not forget the most recent claim by AOC, the representative from New York, that we only have 10 more years before it's all over and a done deal. Another prediction on climate that more than likely isn't going to come true. This is what these people do. It's how they scare people into giving up chunks of their freedom for their benefit instead of ours. An official who came out with her statement pretty much confirmed what they're trying to do and what it's all about, if you're willing to read between the lines. And then they had a thing at the G7 where certain countries signed up for a charter against online hate speech, something that the president refused to sign, which our Constitution and First Amendment would not allow him to sign. If he was one of them, he would have signed that, no problem. Determines what hate speech is. Who has the right, especially in this country, to set up a system of laws and rules outside of our Constitution? I'll tell you who. Nobody. Like it, don't watch. Or better yet, come up with valid arguments with that person, group, or government for that fact, as to why it shouldn't be, or things shouldn't progress as they are. Because if you believe in the First Amendment, then everything's on the table. I've said this before, and I'll be more than happy to say it again. Everybody in this country, and the world for that fact, should have the right to say what they want, even if it's wrong. And the rest of us should have the balls to point and laugh when they do. Don't listen and choose not to participate in someone else's piss poor ideas and or arguments. Then eventually those ideas die out. Something that the social media companies are trying to manipulate by censoring conservatives, by banning people from certain platforms who have a large following and therefore have a lot of say in the community.
And not
if they
banning
can
others.
shut down those voices, they think that they can control the narrative. But moving on. After the G7, on the way home, Trump made another tweet. Just returned to Washington from France and the very successful G7, only to find that the fake news is still trying to perpetuate the phony story that I wanted to use nuclear weapons to blow up hurricanes before they reach shore. This is so ridiculous, never happened. Yet another example of how the deep state and the mainstream media try to cast dispersions on Trump's character. Something they wouldn't do if he was one of them. Try and take a second to explain what the mainstream media really is. It's a propaganda machine and has been for quite some time. In league with the intelligence agencies to put out certain things at certain times to try and sway the opinion of the American public and the world to the narrative that they'd like to have us believe. Okay, Trump made a push for Russia to be back in the G7, which is a totally legitimate thing to have because they're a world power and that's just the way it ought to be. And several key Democrats, including the freaking traitor Brennan, came out against it. Why would they do that? Because certain narratives would fall apart should Russia and U.S. relations get on a normal track. They can no longer demonize Russia and lay all of these lies on their doorstep. Russia didn't interfere in our elections. That's a story they want you to believe to protect their narrative. Russia didn't collude with Donald Trump. That's another way to insulate themselves from what really goes on by having a fall guy or a scapegoat. There's been this big thing about Syria. Syria asked Russia to get involved because the United States wasn't doing their job. Obama took away the power of the military, the people who strategized to win the conflict, and started running the show himself. And in doing so, allowed the Islamic State to gain power in Syria, because what he said he was going to do, he wasn't doing. Because what he said he was to the American people is not what he was. There are those who have said in the past that the Obama administration built ISIS. Well, if that's not true, they sure did lend a hand. Alright, now we move on to Jeffrey Epstein. The key to unraveling this whole deep state sweater. Because it isn't necessarily Epstein himself that they would have liked to bring the hammer down on. He's just a lapdog. But the owners who run the lapdog, who order the girls and do all the things that none of us would even consider doing, those are the people who run the show. Those are the people who use these girls for their own personal entertainment and way to gain power over the people who wanted to roll in those circles.
And children in general, because it's a big thing within the inner circle of all of this to prey on the innocent. They get off on that shit.
Because in order to hang with them, you have to be like them. And if you're not like them, you ain't getting in. Because they gotta have something on you in order to control you. BNL News, breaking footage outside jail, Jeffrey Epstein. Unusable, authorities say. Well, that's just shocking, isn't it? There are way too many coincidences here for this to be a mere coincidence. And we move on to a little side story about Representative Omar and her possible campaign violations and tax fraud allegations, and the fact that she committed fraud to try to get her brother immigration status in the U.S. by marrying him. This chick is a globalist puppet, there's no doubt about it. Like I said before, in order to get you to dance on their string, they have to have something on you. And it sounds to me like they got plenty of stuff on Representative Omar. So she will do and say whatever she's told, how she's told, when she's told. And thank goodness for organizations like Judicial Watch for filing Freedom of Information Act requests and coming across all of this information and actually pushing it to the proper authorities. Because the deep state has people in place to route all this stuff away so that they can maintain their power structure. Seeing how this works just yet? No, I'll add on a little bit to this based on my own personal experience. You could be standing right next to one of these people, interact with them on a regular basis, and never even know what it is they're into. unless you're very observant and can match up the mismatched pieces as they come your way. Move on to the subject of Andrew McCabe, Deputy Director of the FBI under James Comey. In other words, Jim Comey's right-hand man. Anything he knew or was into, Comey knew. And if you don't know about Andrew McCabe and his connections to the Russia investigations or the origins of it, then you probably don't understand any of this. Because it's been in the news, it's been all over the internet, and it should be fairly obvious to anybody that things aren't what they seem. And like I said last night, if there is no justice as far as Andrew McCabe goes and the people who were connected with him during all of this, that means we've been had. And now, as Dave puts it, down to the border. It came out recently that the Mexican CIA and the US CIA were working together to transport pretty much whatever the hell they wanted to across the border back and forth between the US and Mexico. And it should be fairly obvious to anyone as to why we need a border wall. And as to why the other side is so much against it. It's a huge part of how they fund their underground operations. Let's jump across to the Ukraine, where Joe Biden and company and his son Hunter are in a world of shit. Because it's on the verge of coming out how involved the Bidens were inside of Ukraine and the things that happened there. And even John Kerry's son and John Kerry himself are involved in all of this. And it was just brought to light that Kerry's son tried to distance himself from Biden's son when some Ukraine company paid him $3 million. Leading me to the conclusion that obviously somebody was into something they weren't supposed to be into, or there wouldn't have been such a split between the two. You don't try to distance yourself from your buddy who's doing the right thing. Burisma Holdings. That's the company that the two were involved with, who happened to be in the middle of a money laundering investigation being conducted by the Ukraine. And those are the people that Joe Biden protected, basically, when he bragged about having the prosecutor fired because he threatened to withhold money from the Ukraine government. Alright, now we move on to the interesting part, and I'm sure the part you've all been waiting for. When the show got to the subject of Iran, suddenly my phone went haywire, and it's done things I've never seen it do before. The volume turned way down on its own without me even touching it, and it moved, the YouTube moved on to the next story that would have been behind the X-22 report when it was completed, even though it was only 3/4 of the way through the show. There are some people who would just explain that away as some weird anomaly or whatever. And there are some people who would be scared by that when it happened. Not me. Like I said before, if you don't have the balls to lock fenders with me in person, I'm not going to take you seriously in the first place. So, if someone was making an attempt to throw me off of the trail, it only strengthened my resolve. Well, Dave goes on to say that it would appear that Iran is ready to make a deal, that the economic sanctions that Trump imposed and strengthened after the Iran deal was scrapped have worked, and they're ready to come to the bargaining table. And finally, we move back to Q, why it was created and what it was for. Everything that was covered in this show, Q has covered months ago. The connections between Biden and Ukraine, the climate change hoax, all of this. And he has said, or the organization has said along the way, that future proves past. And for those of you who had the wherewithal to weather the storm of disinformation, you have confirmation that that's true. That everything that has been put out there in so-called breadcrumbs is coming to pass. And those people that say nothing is being done are taking the easy way out, are listening to the propaganda from on the other side. Because there's one thing that we should all remember throughout all of this, is that there's positive and negative on both sides. And one is always working against the other. It's just like Spy versus Spy in the old Mad magazine. One gets up for a little bit, and the other one makes a comeback, and so forth and so on. And you got to know who you're looking at and who you're listening to. Is it the white hat spy, or is it the black hat spy? Understand what Q is, because I've done this for people in various situations. People who were trying to rebuild their engine but weren't exactly sure what to do. People who wanted to run at the demolition derby for the first time but didn't have a clue as to where to start. And I've laid out step by step what they should do along the way to be able to at least make it to the show and compete and not look like a total idiot. And that's all of the Q movement really is.